Our speaker today is Erin Finney, who has been in the area for 3 years. She moved here with her husband's job at Emory and Henry. Having lived in Colorado prior to coming here, she's a psychologist, general psychologist in Abingdon. Enjoys the outdoors, so at least we have the outdoors. I'm not sure there's enough competition. I don't know how we compete with Colorado. When I talk to some people, they say, no, my heart's in the East, so whatever. Anyway, she is going to talk to us about keeping hope alive in dark times, which is very appropriate for now, how we inspire each other to keep going. So, Erin.
Well, hello, friends. Okay, that seems good. Okay, so as Dale said, I'm Erin Jurich Finney, and it's good to see you all here today. So for today's talk, I'd like to explore the idea of hope. In dark times, hope is sometimes elusive, and it seems as though it takes all one has to keep going. And then there's that pure shining moment appearing out of nowhere that changes nothing and yet changes everything for us. Suddenly the impossible seems possible, or the unfixable is fixable after all, or we are not weak and helpless as we believed until that moment. Instead, we are powerful and we create our own solutions. These are old ideas in our collective consciousness, and yet we forget them and need to be reminded of them from time to time. Our artists revive these ideas for us just when life starts to seem stale and worn out. Authors, musicians, performers of all kinds. We are renewed by the experiences and go on to inspire others in turn. So I'd like to share some examples of this idea from a couple of excerpts from some well-known books, and then share a couple of examples from my own life. After that, I'd like to open it up for a group discussion, or group sharing, if you will. And if you feel inclined, you can tell us a short story or two from your perspective. So the first excerpt I'd like to read you is from Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. In the beginning of the novel, our heroine, Jane, is an orphaned 10-year-old child recently sent to Lowood Institution by her aunt. Before sending her, the aunt informed the treasurer and headmaster, basically, of the school, Mr. Brocklehurst, that Jane is a liar and a vicious child. Now, Jane is at Lowood and is about to be introduced to her schoolmates as such. Okay. Hitherto, while gathering up the discourse of Mr. Brocklehurst and Miss Temple, I had not at the same time neglected precautions to secure my personal safety, which I thought would be effected if I could only elude observation. To this end, I had sat well back on the form, and while seeming to be busy with my sum, had held my slate in such a manner as to conceal my face. I might have escaped notice had not my treacherous slate somehow happened to slip from my hand and, falling with an obtrusive crash, directly drawn every eye upon me. I knew it was all over now, and as I stooped to pick up the 2 fragments of slate, I rallied my forces for the worst. It came. "A careless girl," said Mr. Brocklehurst, and immediately after, "It is the new pupil, I perceive." And before I could draw breath, "I must not forget I have a word to say respecting her." Then aloud, how loud it seemed to me, "Let the child who broke her slate come forward." Of my own accord, I could not have stirred. I was paralyzed, but the 2 great girls who sat on each side of me set me on my legs and pushed me towards the dread judge. And then Miss Temple gently assisted me to his very feet, and I caught her whispered counsel, "Don't be afraid, Jane. I saw it was an accident. You shall not be punished." The kind whisper went to my heart like a dagger. Another minute and she will despise me for a hypocrite, thought I, and an impulse of fury against Reed, Brocklehurst, and company bounded in my pulses at the conviction. I was no Helen Burns. "Fetch that stool," said Mr. Brocklehurst, pointing to a very high one from which a monitor had just ridden. It was brought. "Place the child upon it." and I was placed there, by whom I don't know. I was in no condition to note particulars. I was only aware that they had hoisted me up to the height of Mr. Brocklehurst's nose, and that he was within a yard of me, and that a spread of shot orange and purple silk pelisses and a cloud of silvery plumage extended and waved below me. Mr. Brocklehurst hemmed. "Ladies," said he, turning to his family, "Miss Temple, teachers, and children, do you all see this girl?" Of course they did, for I felt their eyes directed like burning glasses against my scorched skin. "You see, she is yet young. You observe she possesses the ordinary form of childhood. God has graciously given her the shape that he has given to all of us. No signal deformity points her out as a marked character. Who would think that the evil one has already found a servant and agent in her? Yet such, I grieve to say, is the case." A pause, in which I began to steady the palsy of my nerves, and to feel that the Rubicon was passed, and that the trial no longer to be shirked must be firmly sustained. "My dear children," pursued the black marble clergyman with pathos, "this is a sad, melancholy occasion, for it becomes my duty to warn you that this girl, who might be one of God's own lambs, is a little castaway, not a member of the true flock, but evidently an interloper and an alien. You must be on your guard against her. You must shun her example. If necessary, avoid her company, exclude her from your sports, and shut her out from your converse. Teachers, you must watch her. Keep your eyes on her movements, weigh well her words, scrutinize her actions, punish her body to save her soul, if indeed such salvation be possible. For, my tongue falters while I tell it, this girl, this child, the native of a Christian land, worse than many a little heathen who says its prayers to Brahma and kneels before Juggernaut, this girl is a liar." Now came a pause of 10 minutes, during which I, by this time, in perfect possession of my wits, observed all the female Brocklehursts produce their pocket handkerchiefs and apply them to their optics, while the elderly lady swayed herself to and fro, and the two younger ones whispered, "How shocking!" Mr. Brocklehurst resumed. "This I learned from her benefactress, from the pious and charitable lady who adopted her in her orphan state, reared her as her own daughter, and whose kindness, whose generosity, the unhappy girl repaid by an ingratitude so bad, so dreadful, that at last her excellent patroness was obliged to separate her from her own young ones, fearful lest her vicious example should contaminate their purity. She has sent her here to be healed, even as the Jews of old sent their diseased to the troubled pool of Bethesda. And teachers, superintendent, I beg of you not to allow the waters to stagnate around her." With this sublime conclusion, Mr. Brocklehurst adjusted the top button of his surtout, muttered something to his family, who rose, bowed to Miss Temple, and then all the great people sailed in state from the room. Turning at the door, my judge said, "Let her stand half an hour longer on that stool, and let no one speak to her during the remainder of the day." There I was then, mounted aloft. I, who had said I could not bear the shame of standing on my natural feet in the middle of the room, was now exposed to general view on a pedestal of infamy. What my sensations were, no language can describe, but just as they all arose, stifling my breath and constricting my throat, a girl came up and passed me. In passing, she lifted her eyes. What a strange light inspired them! What an extraordinary sensation that ray sent through me! How the new feeling bore me up! It was as if a martyr, a hero, had passed as slave or victim, and imparted strength in the transit. I mastered the rising hysteria, lifted up my head, and took a firm stand on the stool. Helen Burns asked some slight question about her work of Miss Smith, was chidden for the triviality of the inquiry, returned to her place, and smiled at me as she again went by. What a smile! I remember it now, and I know that it was the effluence of the fine intellect of true courage. It lit up her marked lineaments, her thin face, her sunken gray eye, like a reflection from the aspect of an angel. Yet at that moment Helen Burns wore on her arm the untidy badge. Scarcely an hour ago I had heard her condemned by Miss Scatcherd to a dinner of bread and water on the morrow, because she had blotted an exercise in copying it out. Such is the imperfect nature of man. Such spots are there on the disk of the clearest planet, and eyes like Miss Scatcherd's can only see those minute defects and are blind to the full brightness of the orb. So, just imagine this poor 10-year-old girl, and then suddenly everything has changed in this moment, where another schoolgirl just lifts her eyes and smiles. Incredible. Okay, so later on in the story, Jane is an 18-year-old governess at Thornfield Hall. she first encounters the gruff Mr. Rochester as he races toward the house, but has a spill and sprains his ankle. The story is told first by Jane, and then later on by Mr. Rochester. Now, Jane, why don't you say, well, sir, I have not done? You are looking grave. You disapprove of me still, I see, but let me come to the point. Last January, rid of all mistresses, in a harsh, bitter frame of mind, the result of a useless, roving, lonely life, corroded with disappointment, sourly disposed against all men, and especially against all womankind, for I began to regard the notion of an intellectual, faithful, loving woman as a mere dream. Recalled by business, I came back to England. On a frosty winter afternoon, I rode in sight of Thornfield Hall. Abhorred spot! I expected no peace, no pleasure there. On a stile in Hay Lane, I saw a quiet little figure sitting by itself. I passed it as negligently as I did the pollard willow opposite to it. I had no presentiment of what it would be to me, no inward warning that the arbitress of my life, my genius for good or evil, waited there in humble guise. I did not know it, even when, on the occasion of Mesrour's accident, it came up and gravely offered me help. Childish and slender creature, it seemed as if a linnet had hopped to my foot and proposed to bear me on its tiny wing. I was surly, but the thing would not go. It stood by me with strange perseverance, and looked and spoke with a sort of authority. I must be aided, and by that hand, and aided I was. When once I had pressed the frail shoulder, something new, a fresh sap and sense, stole into my frame. It was well I had learnt that this elf must return to me, that it belonged to my house down below, or I could not have felt it pass away from under my hand, and seen it vanish behind the dim hedge without singular regret. I heard you come home that night, Jane, though you probably were not aware that I thought of you or watched for you. Okay, so stop there. So, 8 years later, she has the chance to completely change this man's life when he was at his darkest and worst and had completely lost hope in humanity. So there's that. The next excerpt I'd like to share comes from J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. So hopefully all of you either have, read this or, don't need to. I won't spoil anything for anyone. Okay, in this scene, our hero Harry is a 13-year-old wizard who has been plagued by Dementors in his third year at Hogwarts. They have been on the ground searching relentlessly for the escaped prisoner of Azkaban, but haven't seemed to mind stealing happiness from the students and replacing it with cold, dark misery. Harry himself has had several fainting spells as a result of Dementor encounters and was working with his professor after hours to learn the spells to keep himself safe. The Dementors are sometimes allowed to perform the Dementor's Kiss on the worst of the worst, which is a fate worse than death. The Dementor is allowed to suck the soul out of the person, however, the body goes on living. In the scene I'll read to you, Harry is trapped by these Dementors, and the adult wizards are all unconscious and unable to help this time. Okay. Harry set off at a run, Hermione right behind him. The yelping seemed to be coming from near the lake. They pelted toward it, and Harry, running flat out, felt the cold without realizing what it must mean. The yelping stopped abruptly. As they reached the lake shore, they saw why. Sirius had turned back into a man. He was crouched on all fours, his hands over his head. "No," he moaned. "No, please." And then Harry saw them. Dementors, at least 100 of them, gliding in a black mass around the lake toward them. He spun around, the familiar icy cold penetrating his insides, fog starting to obscure his vision. More were appearing out of the darkness on every side. They were encircling them. "Hermione, think of something happy," Harry yelled, raising his wand, blinking furiously to try and clear his vision, shaking his head to rid it of the faint screaming that had started inside it. "I'm going to live with my godfather. I'm leaving the Dursleys." He forced himself to think of Sirius, and only Sirius, and began to chant, "Expecto Patronum! Expecto Patronum!" Black gave a shudder and rolled over, lay motionless on the ground, pale as death. "He'll be all right. I'm going to go home and live with him." Expecto Patronum! Hermione, help me! Expecto Patronum! Expecto, Hermione whispered. Expecto, expecto. But she couldn't do it. The Dementors were closing in, barely 10 feet from them. They formed a solid wall around Harry and Hermione and were getting closer. Expecto Patronum! Harry yelled, trying to blot the screaming from his ears. Expecto Patronum! A thin wisp of silver escaped his wand and hovered like mist before him. At the same moment, Harry felt Hermione collapse next to him. He was alone, completely alone. Expecto, expecto Patronum! Harry felt his knees hit the cold grass. Fog was clouding his eyes. With a huge effort, he fought to remember. Sirius was innocent. Innocent. We'll be okay. I'm going to live with him. Expecto Patronum! He gasped. By the feeble light of his formless Patronus, he saw a Dementor halt, very close to him. It couldn't walk through the cloud of silver mist Harry had conjured. A dead, slimy hand slid out from under the cloak. It made a gesture as though to sweep the Patronus aside. No! No! Harry gasped. He's innocent! Expecto Patronum! He could feel them watching him, hear their rattling breath like an evil wind around him. The nearest Dementor seemed to be considering him. Then it raised both its rotting hands and lowered its hood. Where there should have been eyes, there was only thin, gray, scabbed skin, stretched blankly over empty sockets. But there was a mouth, a gaping, shapeless hole, sucking the air with the sound of a death rattle. A paralyzing terror filled Harry so that he couldn't move or speak. His Patronus flickered and died. White fog was blinding him. He had to fight. Expecto Patronum! He couldn't see, and in the distance he heard the familiar screaming. Expecto Patronum! He groped in the mist for Sirius and found his arm. They weren't going to take him. But a pair of strong, clammy hands suddenly attached themselves around Harry's neck. They were forcing his face upward. He could feel its breath. It was going to get rid of him first. He could feel its putrid breath. His mother was screaming in his ears. She was going to be the last thing he ever heard. And then, through the fog that was drowning him, he thought he saw a silvery light growing brighter and brighter. He felt himself fall forward onto the grass. Face down, too weak to move, sick and shaking, Harry opened his eyes. The Dementor must have released him. The blinding light was illuminating the grass around him. The screaming had stopped. The cold was ebbing away. Something was driving the Dementors back. It was circling round him and Sirius and Hermione. The rattling, sucking sounds of the Dementors were fading. They were leaving. The air was warm again. With every ounce of strength he could muster, Harry raised his head a few inches and saw an animal amid the light, galloping away across the lake. Eyes blurred with sweat, Harry tried to make out what it was. It was as bright as a unicorn. Fighting to stay conscious, Harry watched it canter to a halt as it reached the opposite shore. For a moment, Harry saw, by its brightness, somebody welcoming it back, raising his hand to pat it, someone who looked strangely familiar. But it couldn't be. Harry didn't understand. He couldn't think any more. He felt the last of his strength leave him, and his head hit the ground as he fainted. So, Harry made sense of this encounter by supposing it was his father who had saved him, despite the inconvenient fact that his father died when he was a toddler. A few hours later, Harry and Hermione were given vague instructions to travel back in time to save more than one innocent life. They retraced their steps in this mission, staying out of sight, and watched the encounter with the Dementors from a different perspective. I'm not going to try and interfere, said Harry quickly, but if we don't see what's going on, how are we going to know when it's time to rescue Sirius? Well, okay then, I'll wait here with Buckbeak, but Harry, be careful, there's a werewolf out there, and the Dementors. Harry stepped outside again and edged around the cabin. He could hear yelping in the distance. That meant the Dementors were closing in on Sirius. He and Hermione would be running to him any moment. Harry stared out toward the lake, his heart doing a kind of drum roll in his chest. Whoever had sent that Patronus would be appearing at any moment. For a fraction of a second he stood, irresolute, in front of Hagrid's door. You must not be seen. But he didn't want to be seen. He wanted to do the seeing. He had to know. And there were the Dementors. They were emerging out of the darkness from every direction, gliding around the edges of the lake. They were moving away from where Harry stood to the opposite bank. He wouldn't have to get near them. Harry began to run. He had no thought in his head except his father. If it was him, if it was really him, he had to know, he had to find out. The lake was coming nearer and nearer, but there was no sign of anybody. On the opposite bank, he could see tiny glimmers of silver, his own attempts at a Patronus. There was a bush at the very edge of the water. Harry threw himself behind it, peering desperately through the leaves. On the opposite bank, the glimmers of silver were suddenly extinguished. A terrified excitement shot through him. Any moment now. "Come on," he muttered, staring about. "Where are you? Dad, come on!" But no one came. Harry raised his head to look at the circle of Dementors across the lake. One of them was lowering its hood. It was time for the rescuer to appear, but no one was coming to help this time. And then it hit him. He understood. He hadn't seen his father. He had seen himself. Harry flung himself out from behind the bush and pulled out his wand. "Expecto Patronum!" he yelled. And out of the end of his wand burst not a shapeless cloud of mist, but a blinding, dazzling silver animal. He screwed up his eyes, trying to see what it was. It looked like a horse. It was galloping silently away from him across the black surface of the lake. He saw it lower its head and charge at the swarming Dementors. Now it was galloping around and around the black shapes on the ground, and the Dementors were falling back, scattering, retreating into the darkness. They were gone. The Patronus turned. It was cantering back toward Harry across the still surface of the water. It wasn't a horse. It wasn't a unicorn either. It was a stag. It was shining brightly as the moon above. It was coming back to him. It stopped on the bank. Its hooves made no mark on the soft ground as it stared at Harry with its large silver eyes. Slowly, it bowed its antlered head, and Harry realized, "Prongs," he whispered. But as his trembling fingertips stretched toward the creature, it vanished. Harry stood there, hand still outstretched. Then with a great leap of his heart, he heard hoofs behind him. He whirled around and saw Hermione dashing toward him, dragging Buckbeak behind her. Okay, so we'll leave them there. So in this one, it turns out that Harry, in fact, is his own rescuer. He thought it was somebody else, but he did the deed himself, and that brought a whole new level of confidence to his life. His father, was not in his life. Unfortunately, that was a desperate wish, but at the same time, he learned through that experience that something of his father lived on inside of him. And so now I'll share a couple stories from my own life at different times. So as Dale mentioned, I'm a psychologist, and so usually when people come to see me in my office, they are not the happiest they have ever been. This was the case for a teenage girl who came into my office some years ago. She was troubled, desperate, and convinced that nothing could help. As is often the case, I can't take away the troubles the person faces, but I can listen with empathy and help to lighten the load somewhat. Months later, feeling better, she told me about her first encounter with me. She entered my office, and the first thing she saw was the background picture on my computer, which happened to be a lighthouse. Lighthouses had always been special to her and represented hope. Upon seeing the lighthouse, which was actually just the default picture on the computer, I hadn't chosen it, but I hadn't changed it either. It was just sort of there. She got the signal. She felt that she could instantly trust me to help guide her out of her darkness. At the end of our work together, she gave me a lighthouse figurine, which I still keep in my office today. I've moved offices several times since then, but the miniature lighthouse always comes too. It helps remind me of the task at hand, how sadness and suffering is eventually chased away by the light, and, of my duty to be what I can to those in need in that moment. In a psychologist's life, there are also very trying days when it seems as though all the sadness and the darkness of the world comes to my door and stays. There are times where I wonder whether I've chosen the right career, whether I will eventually feel too drained to continue, or how much longer I must plod on before something gets a little bit easier. Some days it feels as though there are invisible Dementors lurking in my office, intent on sucking happiness out of my psyche and maybe waiting for the chance to suck out my soul. After one such day, I came home in a rather downtrodden state, wondering how I was going to come into my home and interact with my family. How was I going to have the energy to get through the evening, be nice to them, and not infect them with my bad mood? I braced myself, got out of the car, and looked to my front door. As it so happened that day, at that moment, my beautiful daughter saw that I had come home and had run to open the door for me. She was wearing this soft yellow shirt. There was a halo of hair around her head. You know how, when you wear braids and then some of the hair comes out and it kind of forms this little halo? Anyway, so there's a hair halo. And the late afternoon sun was hitting her just right. She looked like an angel. Her whole face was lit up in delight at seeing her mother return home, like this was the best thing that could have possibly happened to her. Seeing her there in that moment, this angelic, happy creature with a smile 10 feet wide, who was happy to see me there, changed everything in that moment. Instantly washed out, evaporated that feeling of being drained and worn out and irritable, replaced by gratitude, amazement, and wonder that this sweet girl, this angel, was my daughter, seemed to be heaven sent just for me. And she enjoyed seeing me as that was the thrill of her life. Just incredible. That's a moment I will never, ever forget. I recall it when I need to remember the important things in my life and when I need to remember to let the rest go. For her, that was just another day. Her mother came home, dinner was eaten, life went on as normal. But for me, that is an image and a memory that I will savor for the rest of my life. So now I'd like to invite those willing to share a memory or two from each perspective, if you're interested. So that of the hope giver and that of the recipient.